My name is Serafina the Masked Lady. I was once human. Since then, I have lived many lives. I have been loved and reviled, adored and despised, been the child of a poor prostitute and a courtesan revered by thousands. When I was a child, a stranger with no face offered me the ability to move between the worlds. Since then, my every death has led to a new life. I once had a true love. He was ripped away from me when I was murdered in the 18th century. I search for him still. In the meantime, I walk in the shadows behind the universe, visiting realms both exquisite and terrible and bringing back stories and rhymes to amaze the mind and enchant the ear. Through my YouTube channel, I send the stories out into the world, hoping that my true love will hear them and reply. Hoping, if he does not, that I will find in the other souls who listen kindred spirits to help ease the pain. What of you, stranger? Did you come here tonight seeking a mystery? Do you hunger for a spark of excitement, for the dark thrill of fear? Will you listen as my tales unfold, knowing that some may very well take on lives of their own? Consider, stranger, whether you have the courage to walk between the worlds with Serafina the Masked Lady. Hello there, my delicious darlings, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have something a little different for you. It is a legend that comes from another Earth, in another universe, where the people who live in the cold north tell whispered stories around their campfires. Today's myth, in particular, concerns the sound that emerges when the wind whistles over the rooftops and howls in the chimneys. Is it just the movement of the air? Not according to this legend. Come with me now to another world. When the wind cries. Have you ever wondered why the wind cries at night? Why, when the rain lashes down and storms batter the mountaintops, the wind stalks the roof of the world, growling like an animal? Is it only the angle of the air hitting the mountain slopes? Or is there something else out there in the darkness, something as hungry and furious as the wind? In the icy regions at the top of the world, where my father's fathers first built homes of wood to shield themselves from the cold, they have a legend explaining why the wind cries. Well, I call it a legend. To my grandfather, it was simply the truth. I was barely 6 the first time I heard this story, and perhaps 12 when my grandfather passed on to the world beyond the sight. So my memory may not be exact. Nonetheless, I will set the tale down as well as I can. What you make of the story is up to you. In the years that followed the creation of man, my grandfather told me one night, as we sat close to his glowing hearth fire, our fronts hot and our backs pebbled with cold. After Adam and Eve had left the Garden of Eden, but before men were so numerous upon the earth as to consider themselves its kings, a fragment of the human race traveled up from the warm climate that had spawned them and into a mountainous country at the roof of the world. They settled there, amongst the chilly fjords and underneath the blazing night skies, and eventually they took the name Sternafolk, the people of the stars. The Sternafolk were not alone, even in the chilly northern climes. In those days, there were 5 orders of life upon the planet. There were the angels, loyal to the Creator, coming and going about his business on the earth. Second, there were the fallen angels, who would latterly be called demons. Third were human beings, and then there was the 4th category. Nobody has ever agreed precisely where the 4th order life forms came from. Some say that Adam's first wife, Lilith, after leaving her husband, mated with demons to create them. Others say that God seated them on the earth as caretakers of mankind. But they later broke their orders and went rogue. The 4th order beings were profane, certainly. They had bodies, they had blood and bone, breath and thought, and physical lives that began and ended. Sometimes too quickly. Some looked like fire-breathing serpents, others gigantic humanoids. Their forms were many and diverse. Their abilities were nearly as manifold. The 5th category of beings existing at that time might be called gods with a small g. spiritual beings who were not deities but nonetheless powerful. Fifth category life forms could change their physical appearance. They were capable of great speed, strength, and even controlling the elements. Most were so long-lived as to appear immortal. In those days, the younger tribes of mankind were innocent and credulous, and some worshipped the beings as deities. Those who remembered the Creator called them powers instead. Two of the powers were named Arij and Injera. Like the angels, Arij and Injera remembered their Creator and never sought worship for themselves. Despite that, they looked kindly on the infant human race and wished to nurture and protect them. Protection was needed. The fourth order of beings tended to breed indiscriminately, which was not a problem in itself. However, over the millennia, their amours led to the development of many different races. Some of the fourth order races were wise and beautiful. The Irilin mainly lived in the woodlands and played beautiful songs beneath the starlight. It was the Irilin that mankind, in its later days, would remember as elves. Then there were the Minikin, talented miners who worked with precious metals and ore. Other species were fouler. There were the half-bred demons who could track human blood from a mile away and great-clawed birds who could easily carry a man. Sadly, several of those races had developed a hunger for human flesh. At first, they would only pick off outliers, the elderly or the mad, men and women who had been cast out by their communities or who preferred to live alone. As time advanced, the creatures grew bolder. Hunting parties were taken out. Families lost fathers and sons within miles of home. Seeing the people of the village weeping and tearing their hair in anguish, Arij and Injera agreed that something needed to be done. Arij took a piece of his flesh and Injera a drop of her blood, and with them, they formed a great wolf, the father of all the dire wolves that ever roamed the earth. They named the wolf Sartos, which means justice. When the rain fell and the winds were high, Kartos would roam the earth's wild places, protecting our people's huts. If he could, he would drive away the creatures that hunted us for meat. If not, he would devour them. In the time of my father's father, the Sterna folk came to know Certus by sight. Hunters would glimpse him beyond the village's edge, constantly slipping through the snowflakes in the distance, never imposing himself on the people he protected. If Sartus had not been there to fulfill his duty, our tribe might have vanished from the earth altogether. As it was, we endured, but not without our losses. Despite Certus's work, as the number of humans on the face of the earth grew, so too did the threats to their lives. In some places, men huddled together, their villages growing larger and larger until they formed the first cities. This was a good thing in some ways, for the flesh hunters avoided such concentrations of humanity. However, the lack of space also caused hunger, crime, and disease. In other places, people clung to the banks of rivers and oceans, reaping the earth's riches by day but hiding in their homes at night. Fear is not good for the soul. Arij and Injera understood that, for mankind to truly flourish, they needed to focus on something beyond mere survival. Between them, the two came up with a plan. Again, Arij and Injera sacrificed their flesh and blood, and this time, Injera added a fragment of her bone. In doing so, they created the first female wolf. They named the wolf Theris, which means she who overcomes. Theris was even stronger than the first wolf. Together, they cut a bloody swath through the beings that hunted humankind. Although Injera never allowed them to be destroyed outright, for her heart spoke against her when she considered the genocide of an entire people. Theris and Certus did their work well, and they might have continued in the same vein had not a power greater than both Arij and Injera intervened. Certus first liked, then respected, then adored Theris. It took Theris a little longer to warm to him, but before too long, the giant wolves fell profoundly and devotedly in love. The two great wolves continued to work as partners and as lovers, and their enemies mourned the moment they were unleashed upon the world. Then love did what love always does, it creates. Theris conceived and a short time later gave birth to 11 beautiful wolf cubs. Theris's instinct to hunt was overwhelming, so she and Certus alternated caring for the young ones and hunting the night. Certus glowed with love and pride for his cubs, but Theris's adoration for her young was all-consuming. All was well as long as she could keep them tucked close and safe in her den. Her cubs grew quickly, however. Soon, they wished to hunt beside their mother. After many tense conversations, Certus and Theris agreed the cubs had to be allowed to experience the world. Gradually, Theris and Certus introduced them to their surroundings. Slowly but surely, the cubs learned to hunt, track, run, and fight. Combat training was done amongst themselves, and Certus quickly broke up any scuffles that seemed too intense. One of the cubs, the youngest male, was called Carriage. He was brave and willful. Sadly, he perished early. He was racing his brother along the edge of a cliff, so close to the edge that his mother would have had their hides if she had seen them. And the packed ice and snow crumbled away, sending Carriage plummeting into a crevice that closed in on him moments later, crushing him out of the world. The family mourned bitterly. For days, the howling of the bereaved wolves echoed across the ice. Not even Erich and Injera could retrieve the young wolf's body. To honor him, the two gods formed an image of Carriage out of ice and set it at the top of the world, the very North Pole. There, it would stand forever as a memorial for him. Sadly, Carriage was not the only loss the wolf family suffered. It wasn't long before the cubs of Certus and Theris were fully grown, ready, as their parents had been, to defend humanity. Sometimes, life was quiet and good. The wolves laughed. They could run and tussle together and be a family. More frequently, however, they were forced to go out and face enemies, so many of them that the newly trained cubs were sometimes forced to battle alone. On a night when 10 of the 11 surviving members of the wolf family were out battling enemies, Injera received an urgent call for help. Injera carried the call, and the worry in her great, dark eyes was an omen of misfortune. Injera appeared before the youngest female cub Cedrus in all her earthly glory, and the young wolf bowed her head in reverence. Injera asked after Theris and Certus, and Cedrus explained that they were already on their own missions. Injera hesitated but asked Cedrus if she felt ready to take on a solo mission. Cedrus was delighted by the notion. Poor child, she could not see what was ahead. Injera had a special love for the neighboring Akaber clan. Long ago, her own daughter had married one of their sons, and although that daughter had since passed away in an awful accident, her children and grandchildren lived there still. The lands where the Akaber lived ran along the shore of Silver Lake. The clan made most of their living from fishing and carving objects from the bones, shells, and stones they found cast up upon the shore. Unfortunately, the abundance of fish in the area also attracted a race known as Julkatan. Unlike normal cats, the Julkatan had no love for humanity. Julkatans were enormous, with titanic appetites, and while they were more than happy to gobble down a mouthful of fish, if their usual prey became scarce, they were more than happy to snatch up a human child. One particular Julkatan had been troubling the shores of Silver Lake for years now. So far, she had only been able to slay one old man. The poor fisherman had been asleep when the creature had found him. Since then, the clan's warriors had beaten it back with clubs and spears. This time, however, the foul thing had managed to slip out behind the Akaber's huts and kidnap the chief's young daughter out of the chief's very tent. Too late, the child's nursemaid discovered her absence. The last sight of the child had been from a distance as the Julkatan dragged her out onto the ice. The villagers had mourned, of course, but they'd refused to send men after her. They said throwing away their people's lives would be a waste. Everyone had given her up for dead. The men had advised the chief to do the same. Understandably, he refused. His love for his child was desperate. He had reached out to Injera, begging her aid. He would trade his own life for his daughter's, he said, if Injera would only bring her safely home. Injera had no intention of taking the man's life, but her heart wept for the child. Injera offered Cedrus the chance to save her. Cedrus was off in a flash. The scent was not hard to find. The odor of the Julketan was strong and bitter. As for the child, her innocence and fear were like a beacon. They had gone a long way, though, and time was short. Cedrus ran until her paws were raw and bloody, until every leap and bound was accompanied by a flash of pain. Finally, her sensitive hearing latched onto the sound of a child crying. Scooting around a snowbank, she saw the chief's daughter backed up against a slope of collapsed ice while the Julketan loomed over her. Its paw was raised, and its claws, like steak knives but bigger and larger, glimmered in the moonlight. Cedrus howled, and the sound distracted the Julketan, allowing the chief's daughter to leap aside, out of the reach of her paws. Immediately, the Julketan swung towards Cedrus. The high, howling sound it made could have been mistaken for a woman in pain. Cedrus didn't waste a moment. She attacked. The conflict was fierce. Cedrus was quick and determined, but the Julketan outranked her in size and strength. Both used their individual powers to great effect. In truth, Cedrus was outmatched, but her care for the innocent child and her fury at the thought of what the Julketan meant to do to her gave her the edge. At first, as the fight drew on, however, Cedrus started to flag. She had cried to the child to run, to head back for the village and home, but she'd been so distressed that she'd forgotten to speak the language of the Sternafolk. Not understanding the howl, the child had moved from side to side, but only sufficiently to escape the immediate conflict. She had not used the opportunity, as she should have to run back to the tents of her fathers and her best hope of safety. So it was that, when the Julketan struck Cedrus a mammoth blow to the head, knocking her onto her side and halfway out of consciousness, the fiend could quickly recapture its target. While Cedrus was fighting pain and dizziness, waiting for the ice and the stars to stop revolving around her, the Julketan was chasing the chief's daughter into an area where thin rocks, looking like giant blades, thrust up from underneath the ice and gouged into the sky. When Cedrus finally recovered her equilibrium, she looked up and uttered a low whine of dismay. The child was cornered against one of the spiky rocks, and this time, the Julketan meant to finish her. There was only one hope of saving the chief's daughter, and Cedrus grasped it with both paws. Cedrus leapt, an enormous jump, further and faster than any jump she had managed before. In a flash, she was in front of the girl, tearing out her enemy's throat as she went. Simultaneously, the creature's claws sliced Cedrus across the middle. The evil creature died in a burst of blood. Cedrus landed on the ice, looked into the face of the chief's daughter, let out a single whimper, and gave up her spirit to the universe. By the time Injera appeared to collect the human child, Cedrus was beyond healing. Injera brought the news of Cedrus's death to Certus and Theris herself. Theris's fury was so great that Injera had to use her powers to bind the wolf. Otherwise, she would have attacked her own family in her despair. This time, Theris would not be consoled. She blamed the child for the death of her cub and, through the girl, all of mankind. The swath of blood and death that Theris cut across the world still lingers in the minds of men. The Viking conception of the world's end, Ragnarok, assisted by the immense wolf Fenrir, was shaped by their memories of Theris' slaughter. Not a homestead, church, or temple was safe from her anguish. She did not even spare the cradles. Certus, too, was heartbroken by the loss of his daughter, but he retrained his compassion and the recollection of his duty. When Theris set her sights on a city of 100,000 people, meaning to kill them all, Certus intervened. He set himself before the city and did all he could to turn his love aside. 3 times, Theris allowed him to drive her back, but on her 4th attempt, she drove Certus to the ground and bit from his shoulder a chunk of flesh so large that Certus could not get up again. Some of the humans in the city had been able to escape while Certus had Theris distracted, but many, too many, had stayed locked in their homes. Theris devoured them. She didn't hear their screams or pleas for mercy. When the last sobs had been silenced, Theris had leapt onto a chunk of sea ice and lain down upon it as it floated on the black water. With Certus wounded, perhaps mortally, and the rest of the world in peril from she who should be its defender, Erich and Injera were forced to devise a plan. The only ones who could help them were Theris's cubs. Much as they loved their mother, the 9 cubs mourned their father's fate. They also knew that Theris could not be allowed to lay waste to the human race. So, on the night of the midwinter solstice, when the sky was clear and the stars shone in the sky like great chips of diamond, Lyra, Anya, Micah, Sarah, Ivan, and Berith raced out across the ice until they found a steep valley enclosed on 3 sides by high black mountains. They hid themselves just beyond it, knowing that the bouncing of sound would make it seem that they were inside it. When all was ready, and Erich and Injera had given them the sign, the cubs began to howl. They cried for help. They howled that they were in pain, that they were frightened and alone. They called for their mother, and even in her madness, she heard and answered. The earth shook as she raced towards her babies. In moments, she entered the valley, racing for the far end. That was when the cubs all howled as one. The sound shook the earth, the rocks at the mouth of the valley fell, and soon, the only exit had been completely buried. Injera and Erich laid a spell on the surrounding mountains so Theris could never cross them. Thus was the second wolf guardian of the world trapped in a prison of stone, never to be released until the end of days. Theris scrambled at the stone walls of her prison. She snarled and growled. Finally, she held her fury towards the cruel skies. The cubs heard their mother's cries, and the pleading in them broke their hearts, but they understood that if she was freed, the end of the human race would come. So they stopped up their ears and hardened their hearts. Seeing their sorrow, Erich and Injera cast a spell that covered Theris's prison, silencing, for the most part, the wolf's pitiful cries. The spell was not complete, however. Whenever the rain fell, and the winds whirled above the tops of the world, the cries of the she-wolf Theris could be heard all around the globe. There is one spark of light in this sad tale. Certus, who was being cared for carefully by Erich, actually survived the wound that Theris had inflicted on him. By the time he woke, Theris was already in her prison, and to begin with, Certus was furious at the cubs for confining her. When Erich and Injera showed him the truth of what had happened, his perspective changed, and the cubs were able to reunite with their father. Certus and his cubs were true to their mission. Many believe they still are, that they continue to run the roof of the world and to watch over the Sternifolk, however numerous we become. Sometimes, the great wolves can still be glimpsed beyond the smoke of the watchfires, flashes of silver against the midnight sky. Sometimes, they even know joy, but their happiness is not complete. So, my grandfather concluded, when the night is dark, and the wind prowling around our hut sounds like an animal in distress, you will know that you are hearing Theris, the mother of wolves, in her despair. When you hear her, say a prayer for the wolf mother that the madness leaves her and her anguish is eased. Whatever her crimes, she has loved entirely and with all of her heart. Once you have done that, pray that the magic of Erich and Injera survives, for when Theris runs free to claim her husband and her cubs, it will mean the ending of our world. Well, there you have it. What do you think of the legend? Did you find it frightening or sad? I must admit that I had a small sniffle thinking of Theris trapped in the valley, missing her cubs. That said, if she really does exist on our Earth, I hope that Theris doesn't escape for a long, long time. I must wish you good evening now. My warm bed and feety pajamas are beckoning. Thank you again for joining me tonight. See you soon.